Hello and welcome to our second video for topic 3. So part 2 on sexual reproduction is going to be broken into 2 parts. And this part is going to focus on reproduction using cones. So if you remember last video, we talked about that plants can be selectively bred or genetically modified. Okay. And then we went into talking about asexual reproduction. We said it's often quick and it provides exact copies of the parent plant. So if the parent plant was an excellent plant and had a lot of desirable characteristics, asexual reproduction is a really positive thing. However, providing an exact copy of something that's not a great plant clearly wouldn't be the best. Also, the danger with asexual reproduction is if you have a whole section of plants that are all the same, if there's something that they're susceptible or weak against, such as a pest, if that pest shows up, they're all going to die, and we're going to lose all of the plants, most likely. Okay, so it helps to have plants that aren't all genetically identical. And to do that or to get that, plants need to reproduce sexually. Okay, now sexual reproduction involves the production of seeds and fruit from the specialized cells of two parents. Okay, so this time we have two different parents. Okay, there's only one way to kind of get around this, and we'll talk about that when we get to flowers. So plants produce sexually to produce offspring that are different from the parent plants. And again, this is a positive thing usually as it brings out new characteristics, and lots of times those new characteristics can be positives. Okay, so this helps plants adapt to their environment over generations, and they do this by producing seeds. So we're going to see at the end of these process, a seed is going to be formed. So the first way that we're going to look at is through the use of cones. Okay, so pine trees and other cone-bearing trees produce male and female cones. So that's maybe something that you didn't realize before. But coniferous trees, okay, which basically just mean cone-bearing trees, or when you think of like a Christmas tree or trees that have those green needles like a pine tree, okay, they actually have two types of cones, and you can see them in the pictures here. So the smaller cones are the male cones, and the larger cones are the female cones. And the male cone is going to produce pollen, okay, and that pollen actually contains the sperm cells that are needed to fertilize the ovule or the egg in the female cones. Okay, so the ovules are small bumps on the end of a cone. Now, once this ovule is fertilized, it's going to take a long time, but a seed is going to be formed, and eventually that seed will fall back out of the pine cone into the ground, in which hopefully it will grow to be a tree. Okay, so if we take a look, also sometimes pine cones will need heat to release their seeds. So that's sometimes why forest fires are beneficial. Is when the heat from the forest fire comes, it opens all the pine cones that have fallen to the ground, or we're still hanging on the trees, and many seeds fall into the ground, planting new trees. So, with fertilization, wind carries pollen grains from the male to the female cones. Okay? So, a cone or a flower is considered to be fertilized when pollen comes into contact with an ovule or egg. Okay, there's two different terms, and sometimes they get confused with each other. There's pollination, and then there's fertilization. Pollination happens first, and it has to do with the pollen getting from one plant to the other, or getting from a male cone to a female cone. Okay, that's pollination. Now, once at the female cone, if that pollen manages to connect with an ovule or an egg, that's called fertilization. So pollination must happen before fertilization can happen. Okay, if we take a look in the diagram that we have going on down here, okay, so we have our male cones and our female cone. Okay, now when the pollen here actually manages to make its way to the egg, this is when we would call this to be fertilized. So it's at this moment where the pollen makes its way to the egg that we call it fertilized. Okay. Further to this then, we're going to have a seed formed. So second, we'll have a seed formed. Third, third, that seed is going to fall out of the cone, and eventually it's going to start creating a new tree. So most pollen does not reach the ovule. Okay, so I would encourage you to go to YouTube and take a look for like a video, something along the lines of shaking pollen from a tree. Okay, and you're gonna find these videos where there's massive amounts of pollen that come out in the spring or whenever the tree is ready to be fertilized and to help other trees become fertilized. So there's massive amounts of pollen that can shake out of a tree. It's actually remarkable. But now most of it, as the wind blows it, is just going to fall on the ground. Okay, so most pollen won't actually make it to another cone, which is kind of a sad and quick story for it. So, in the process of pollination, a pollen tube grows down from the pollen grain to the ovule, and the sperm actually swim down this tube and fertilize the egg. And then a tiny fertilized seed begins to grow. So, it's actually a pretty crazy process how it happens. So, we have pollen leaving a male cone, getting to a female cone, then creating a pollen tube down inside the cone where the sperm will swim through and fertilize the egg. And then that egg, now that it has male and female parts to it, or male and female genetics, is actually going to begin to grow, and it's going to grow into a seed that will one day produce a new plant. So female cones of pine trees mature, open, and release their seeds during the fall or the winter months, but it takes like 2 years from pollination at least before the seeds are released. Okay, and again, the heat from forest fires and things like that can also help open the cone. So this is a very slow process, and that's one of the things with sexual reproduction when you compare it to asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is very slow. Okay? It's slow in animals, it's slow in plants, comparatively speaking to asexual reproduction, which can happen very rapidly. So this is a video on cone reproduction that you can watch again if you open the copy of the slide. So that's the end of cone reproduction. So once again, please refer to Google Classroom to figure out what your next instructions are.